You know what's worse than stepping on a Lego brick at 3 in the morning? Being Keir Starmer right now. Because while you're hopping around clutching your foot and questioning your life choices, he's sitting in Downing Street watching GB News deliver yet another migrant crisis update that basically takes his smash the gangs policy, crumples it up, and tosses it straight into the bin. This morning, Eamonn Holmes and Ellie Costello were hosting GB News Breakfast, probably discussing the usual morning fare, when they had to cut everything for breaking news from Dover, and spoiler alert, it wasn't good news. At least 400 migrants were actively crossing the channel as Mark White stood there reporting live, and the criminal gangs were having an absolute field day with a tiny weather window. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where we unpack the political carnage so you can make sense of the madness. Today, we're diving into why this latest surge is an absolute nightmare for Starmer, and why his flagship policy is looking shakier than a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Let's set the scene. Mark White is standing in Dover, which has basically become the epicenter of Britain's ongoing migrant crisis drama. The wind's probably howling, it's freezing cold, and he's delivering news that's going to make the government's morning briefing extremely uncomfortable. At least 400 small boat migrants are in the channel, actively attempting to cross into UK waters. 400. That's not a trickle, that's not a handful, that's a full-blown surge. And this is happening in less than a 12-hour weather window. 12 hours. The criminal gang saw a brief break in the terrible weather, looked at each other and said, "Right lads, it's go time." And off they went, pushing hundreds of desperate people into overcrowded dinghies into one of the most busiest and most dangerous stretches of water in the world. White confirmed that 2 boats had already made it into UK waters, triggering what he called a significant response from multiple border force vessels. But here's where it gets even more dramatic. The lifeboat service had to be called in to assist. Dover Lifeboat, Walmer Lifeboat, all scrambling to search for and rescue small boat migrants making the crossing. Now, let's pause here for a second because this is important. These are lifeboats that are typically manned by volunteers, brave people who risk their own safety to save lives at sea. And they're being pulled into what is fundamentally a failure of government policy. That's not a dig at the lifeboat crews, who are absolute heroes, but it highlights just how out of control this situation has become. When your immigration policy relies on volunteer rescue services to clean up the mess, something has gone very wrong. Now, here's where the knife really twists for Starmer. White pointed out that this latest surge follows a 28-day lull in crossings. 28 days where the boats basically stopped coming because, you guessed it, the weather was terrible. And during those 28 days, supporters of Starmer's smash the gangs policy were practically doing victory laps, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the government's various policies were actually making a difference. Finally, they thought, we're getting somewhere. The gangs are being disrupted, the crossings are declining, Starmer's plan is working. Except, as White very diplomatically pointed out, others had argued it was all down to the weather. And guess what? Those people were absolutely right, because the moment the weather improved, boom, the boats started coming again. Last weekend alone saw more than 750 people cross the channel, pushing the annual total past 40,000 arrivals. And now, just days later, we've got another 400 in the water. It's almost comical if it weren't so tragic. The entire effectiveness of Britain's immigration enforcement strategy is apparently determined by whether or not it's too windy, not by clever policy interventions, not by international cooperation, not by disrupting criminal networks, but by wind speed and wave height. Mother Nature is doing more to control channel crossings than the Home Office, and that should be deeply embarrassing for everyone involved in crafting immigration policy. It's like claiming your diet is working when really you've just been too lazy to walk to the fridge. The results might look similar, but the underlying reality is very different. And it gets worse. White revealed that last night, another 74 people crossed, including more than a dozen women and a child. Maritime security sources condemned the people smuggling gangs as completely reckless for pushing women and children out into boats in freezing cold conditions and driving rain. Which, yes, obviously, these gangs are reckless. They're criminals who profit from human desperation. Expecting them to suddenly develop a conscience is like expecting a scorpion not to sting you because you asked nicely. It's not going to happen. But here's a really dark twist that White exposed. One small boat was forced to return to France this morning. On board was a pregnant woman and a 3-year-old child, both of whom were taken off the boat and hospitalized suffering from hypothermia. Hypothermia. A pregnant woman and a toddler, freezing, suffering because they were put on a boat in conditions no human should endure. White explained that this is actually a deliberate tactic used by the criminal gangs. They put women and children on these boats specifically to ensure a quicker response from maritime rescue services. It's calculated, it's cynical, and it's utterly despicable. The gangs know that rescue services will prioritize boats with vulnerable people on board, and they know that French authorities are much less likely to intervene if there are women and children visible. So they're essentially using the most vulnerable people as human shields and bargaining chips. And this is what we're up against. These aren't disorganized amateurs. These are sophisticated criminal operations that understand the system and exploit every possible weakness. So let's talk about what this means for Keir Starmer and his government, because this is the second major surge in just a few days, and it's making his smash the gangs policy look increasingly ridiculous. The policy was supposed to target the criminal networks, disrupt their operations, and ultimately reduce the number of channel crossings. It was meant to be a sophisticated, intelligence-led approach that would succeed where the conservatives "Stop the Boat" slogan had failed. But here we are, well past 40,000 arrivals for the year, watching hundreds more making the crossing in real time, and the only thing that seems to affect the numbers is whether or not it's raining. The fundamental problem, and this is something that keeps getting overlooked in all the political posturing, is that enforcement alone cannot solve this crisis. You can smash as many gangs as you like, but as long as there's demand, new gangs will emerge to fill the gap. It's the same principle that's made the war on drugs such a spectacular failure for decades. You arrest one drug dealer, another one pops up to take their place. The market doesn't disappear just because you've increased enforcement. And the same applies here. As long as people are desperate enough to pay thousands of pounds and risk their lives to reach the UK, someone will be willing to facilitate that journey for profit. What's really needed, and what no government seems willing to seriously pursue, is a comprehensive approach that includes safe and legal routes for asylum seekers, faster processing of claims, genuine international cooperation that goes beyond press releases, and addressing the root causes that drive people to flee their home countries in the first place. But that's complicated, it's expensive, it doesn't fit on a campaign poster, and it requires politicians to have honest conversations with the public about trade-offs and limitations. So instead we get slogans: "Stop the boats," "Smash the gangs," "Tough on immigration." It's all performative nonsense designed to make it look like something's being done while the actual crisis continues unabated. And the cruel irony here is that the people suffering most from this policy failure aren't the politicians or the commentators or the people arguing about it on social media. It's the migrants themselves, including women and children who are being put in life-threatening situations by criminal gangs who see them as nothing more than cargo. It's the volunteer lifeboat crews who have to risk their own safety in dangerous conditions to rescue people. It's the border force personnel who are overwhelmed and under-resourced. It's the communities in Dover and other coastal areas who are on the front lines of this crisis. Meanwhile, politicians in Westminster argue about whose three-word slogan is better while achieving precisely nothing. The timing of this latest surge couldn't be worse for Starmer politically. He's still in the relatively early stages of his premiership, trying to establish Labour as a credible alternative to the chaos of the last few Conservative governments. Immigration was always going to be one of his biggest challenges, and he knew that. That's why he made such a big deal about smashing the gangs and taking a tough but supposedly smarter approach. But when your policy's effectiveness is entirely dependent on the weather forecast, you've got a serious problem. And your opponents know it. You can bet the Conservatives, despite their own abysmal record on this issue, are preparing to hammer Labour over these figures. Nigel Farage and Reform UK are probably rubbing their hands together with glee. This is political ammunition that they'll use relentlessly. But here's what really frustrates me about this whole situation: the complete lack of honesty from anyone in a position of power. No politician wants to admit that stopping small boat crossings entirely is probably impossible without fundamentally rethinking our entire approach to asylum and migration. No one wants to say that enforcement alone has limits and that you can't just arrest your way out of a global migration crisis driven by war, persecution, poverty, and climate change. No one wants to acknowledge that the current system, which forces people into dangerous crossings because there aren't sufficient legal alternatives, is part of the problem. Instead, we get slogans: "Stop the boats," "Smash the gangs," "Tough on immigration." It's all performative nonsense designed to make it look like something's being done while the actual crisis continues unabated.
And the latest surge from 400 migrants doesn't bode well for Starmer's smash the gangs policy. And I know I said that I was going to try and be positive about this issue, but at the end of the day, there really isn't much positive to talk about. And the last thing I want to say is how heartbroken I am for anyone who's trying to seek asylum and does so illegally. These people are ruining it for everyone, and it's super inane. Well, that's it for this time. Be sure to subscribe to UK Political Insight. I will try to present more positive videos, but honestly, this is an issue that really gets on my nerves. Be sure to leave a comment below on what you think the government should actually be doing differently, because I genuinely would love to hear your perspectives. And if you want to stay on top of all the political chaos coming out of Westminster, hit that notification bell because trust me, there's always more drama around the corner. See you in the next one, and let's hope it's slightly less depressing than this one.